Welcome to Virtual Agile Meetings, everyone. It's great to have you all here. I'd like to introduce Dan Prager, who's going to be discussing the apparent paradox between theory of constraints and Agile at scale. So Dan will explain what all that means. Dan, I'll hand over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Ian. Really great to be doing this talk in this virtual setting, and thank you everyone for joining from Melbourne and around the world. We'll do this in a fairly relaxed manner, so feel free to ask questions along the way, and there'll be some time for more in-depth discussion at the end. So welcome to my the resolution of my personal crisis around am I making a difference? So my promise to you is you'll get some insight into how improvement at a personal, team and organizational level interact, and maybe some other insights along the way. So here's me, and got a couple of websites which are available in the notes, and I have immodestly named a law after myself, Prager's law, which we will get to later in the talk. More a piece of advice that after you make an improvement, the last thing you should do is more work rather than the first thing. Okay, so I've tried to break this subject right down, and there'll be a takeaway for every section. So we'll start by looking at personal and team improvement, a little thing I call Agile heaven and hell. Where should you focus your improvement effort? And then getting to the real nub of what was a crisis for me, team versus organizational improvement. And this is where I identify a contradiction between the advice that you'll get from following the theory of constraints at scale and scaled agile. My resolution, there may be others, we might get into discussing that. The immodestly titled Prager's law, how I believe you can scale improvement effectively, not just from the top of an organization, and conclusion and final thoughts. So please strap in. So firstly, you're going to see a lot of these loop diagrams, common in systems thinking, and I was just starting with the simplest one, which is the crisis of working harder. That if you're working in complex or challenging conditions and you just focus on getting the job done, delivering, doing what you've got to do, but not stepping back to reflect and improve or inspect and adapt, some might say, things aren't going to get any better. You're just applying the same approaches, but they may in fact get harder. So you meet every challenge by just grinding in. So that's working harder. And at a very superficial level, working smarter, if you can have a little bit of time to do that reflection and improvement, that reflection and come up with ideas, experiments, sometimes things improve. So that frees up more time and you get into a bit of a virtuous circle. And a question that has been asked, a very good paper on this, is why is working harder so popular? It seems to, this is sort of an invitation to audience participation.
It's not very popular with me.
It's not popular with you. Yeah. But Ian, have you seen?
I've worked with teams about 4 or 5 years ago. We were doing insane numbers of hours. Yeah.
And any thoughts on why they jump to the faced with the challenge? Why do you choose the red pill in this case versus the green pill?
I think that was the only lever the managers had. They just said it has to be done, make it happen.
Any other?
I think it's easy to measure in terms of amount of work hours, and so they can see if that's where their mind is at, then they can see that metric improve of more hours.
For sure. Dave, I saw you politely.
Yeah, I was just going to say short-term objectives are driving, the way we're always constantly measured on. We've just got to finish this and then we'll get to that. But I've got an objective that it's a quarterly objective. It's a whatever objective. So it's driving a lot of that behavior. I don't have time to improve because we've got to get this done first and then I'll get to that.
Mm. I mean, one great thing about working harder is you do get an immediate, assuming reasonable competence, you do get an immediate positive result. Whereas working smarter involves an investment in time to try and think of a better way. And there is a risk it won't pay off. So you've got to have a bit of dip before it starts to pay off. So there is that short-term bias will tend to take you towards working harder. And then that can be interpreted as success. If the manager pulls that work harder lever and it works, then why not pull it again and again and again? So it's maybe a little bit of a trap there.
Danielle?
Yes, Simone.
Hi, good to see you. I wonder if there's also like a deeper belief around our own worthiness. That's certainly what I find working on my own business. I still work harder, and there's this sort of, it's like you have to prove yourself, and when you stop, who are you? It's an identification with work as well. So don't want to go too deep, but I feel that there's quite a lot there.
I know, and this is like the first substantive slide, and there's a lot to go to. But that's I think there is a lot there about what are the emotional and self-esteem beliefs that drive or reinforce that behaviour. 100%. And I've had to cut from this deck a lot of the obstacles to switching across to working smarter. And that's not to say that working harder isn't, and working hard especially for yourself or for something you believe in, isn't part of the picture. So this is an example from the world of technology, and really this is not specific to Agile or technology or Lean, but I kind of like this one. The vicious cycle of technical debt. So doing a hurried job with poorly written code, then making up for it with support and manual interventions means that your business is getting less efficient, it's making less money, there's less for future. Writing code is a form of investment, programmers tend to be expensive, and so you get into this sort of poor quality vicious cycle. And the alternative, once you've been there for too long, is automate some stuff, reduce the manual labor of incidents, which then frees up people's time. And then you can pay back some of this so-called technical debt, which improves the quality, and you keep going around the loop and you get into the virtuous cycle. And it's just a concrete example of what might be in those circles from the previous slide. So speaking a bit to Simone's point, here's a hypothetical for you, and we've got few enough people that we can go around the room. If you get a full day's work done in the morning, what do you do in the afternoon? Just have a moment to think about it, and then hopefully someone brave will go first. And the way I tend to run these things online is then if you could bounce to another participant, if you can. And if that doesn't work, I'll just get Ian to ask. And it's always okay to pass. So who will be brave enough to go first? If you get a full day's work done, awesome.
I would tend to help others. If I'm in a squad, they might need some help. And by helping others, I might learn something from the way they do things.
Beautiful. Who would you like to bounce to, John?
Ian.
Well, I work on my own business in the morning, and then I go to the beach in the afternoon. And then I work for a Saudi company in the evening through to about 1 a.m. and then I sleep.
The modern lifestyle. Who will you bounce to, Ian?
Darren.
So for me, if I got my full day's work done in the morning, I'd actually generally bias to learn something new because it's within my control.
Right. Who will you bounce to?
I will go to Steve.
I
I would change the world, but I feel that my work is to change the world. So it's like the same thing. So probably I first try to help others if I can. And if I can't help others, I will try to learn how to help them. And maybe I'll go to the beach and read a book about learning what I need to learn.
Awesome.
Oh, so I'll hand over to, well, who has not gone through? Bernd?
Sure. Honestly, it depends. There is no go-to. In certain situations, every one of those answers makes sense. So honestly, can't decide in general.
Cool.
All right. John Farrell, did you go already? You did go already? Ah, sorry. Dave?
Yeah, I was going to say similar to Bernd. Sometimes it's more work, but not so often. If there was a need, then certainly would do that. Probably, and again, helping others if there's someone to help. There's not always someone to help. It just tends to happen when it happens. And I do like learning a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if I was trying to learn something new. But you know what? Sometimes you just need to have an afternoon nap, and that's cool. So if I'm feeling tired, I'll probably have a little nap and then I'd think about it. And I will pass to Murray.
Well, if I was in the office, it'd be some combination of having a break by chatting to people and learning something new, I think. Who hasn't had a go?
Simone?
Yeah. I'm hoping that I'm doing C, D, and E with my work, so I go to the beach in the afternoon.
Nice. And we haven't heard from Karthik, and I'm struggling to get the other gentleman's name.
Yeah.
Karthik, would you like to go?
Yeah. So for me, I think I would go with option B, learning something new. Right. I think that's why I joined this session as well. Whenever I find some time, I always believe on collective wisdom, and that's why I'm here. Thank you. And I would like to pick who's not gone yet. Robin.
Robin, are you on mute?
There is no Robin.
Ah, there's one more.
We've got his Albert.
Albert, are you there?
We've lost Albert.
We've lost Albert. Well, I think it's a privilege to be with such wonderful, enlightened people. The first time I gave this talk, I can say that most people said they'd do more work. And often I find that in teams, there is often a backlog of work or pressure to do more. So let's go to one of my intellectual heroes, Albert Einstein. What would Albert do? And as a young man, while working as a patent clerk, because he was too creative to get a university position, in the mornings, he quickly completed his allotted work. And in the afternoon, he finished his doctorate and wrote 4 revolutionary scientific papers, probably all of which were worthy of Nobel Prizes, and thereby changed the world. And he certainly didn't do just more of the same work. We'll return to Albert later in the talk. So I think you're all on the right track. So first takeaway is to create and sustain those virtuous cycles of improvement. And the bit I've cut from this talk is all the things that are stopping you doing that, or your organization. And so that might be something we'll get back to. So there's a story that I like, which I found out today goes to Rabbi Chaim of Romshishok, who was granted a vision of heaven and hell. And he was taken to hell, where there was all these people who were looking miserable, sitting around a table, emaciated, and on the table there was all of this delicious food, but because their elbows were locked, they had no elbows or they were splintered, they couldn't get the food into the mouths because they couldn't bend at the elbows. There are also versions of this story where they had these long spoons. And I've found a cartoon of this where there's this delicious vegetable soup and there's no way for them to eat it. Don't think too hard. You could probably solve it by just grabbing the spoon a bit lower. But this is the point. In hell, it's not that they're being tortured, but they are being tortured, but indirectly. And then the rabbi was taken by the angel to heaven, which had exactly the same setup, but the people were happy and well fed and talking. And of course, the difference was that they were feeding each other. And then he demanded to be taken back to hell so that he could teach them how to eat the food. And the people there just wouldn't listen. That, why should I help that? Whatever. I hate him or her. Right. So I think there's something to this. And one of the themes is, hard work versus cooperation and sense making, finding solutions. So what the hell has this got to do with Agile? So I reckon at the team level, I can go into most situations and many other competent or even skilled coaches, Scrum Masters, iteration managers, Kanbanistas can go in and slap Scrum or Kanban or something which fits their situation and, visualize work, explain the basics, bit of cross-skilling, bit of Pareto's principle, and get an immediate productivity bump most of the time. And then there's the road to hell. So then the road to hell looks like this. You go, great, we've got this extra capacity. Let's just pump more of the same work through. And the problem with this is that over time, you've just eliminated the slack that you've introduced by removing inefficiency and just replaced it with more work. And people aren't machines, so they're going to burn out. And their performance and their engagement will drop over time, and you'll find yourself in the Agile version of hell, in which the teams are burned out, and they now, likely as not, will blame Agile for doing this to them. In fact, it may even be worse than in the case of traditional projects where there's often a ramp up and ramp down, because we've done this disaggregation of work. We've squeezed that out, and I've had a past colleague refer to this game as Agile Tetris. So don't do that. Instead, what we need to do is set up and sustain these virtuous cycles of improvement, starting at the team level. It can also apply at the personal level, and reinvest in whatever makes sense. And this is where you get up to Sutherland of Scrum fame famously claimed twice the work in half the time. I hate that twice the work because it sort of implies you're doing twice as much. I much prefer twice the value in half the time. And why do I say happy teams? Because there's intrinsic motivation and joy to be gotten out of mastering your craft, getting better, delivering value to customers, and so forth. So it's the choice between a quick 10 to 30% bump, which by conventional standards is still fantastic, and 400% has been reported. I mean, that's there's going to be a distribution there. That's probably coming off something of a low base. But that's the result of going around and around this improvement cycle, not just taking the things that you've learned about, but also learning more about your settings, skilling up, and growing and developing as a team. Unfortunately, I see a fair bit of this nowadays. So yeah. So that's the claim at team level. And so the learning there is avoid agile hell and shoot for agile heaven. Now, who here is familiar with the theory of constraints? Yeah. Great. So I'm not going to do the whole thing of Goldratt's theory of constraints, but I'll just do a quick recap because it's important for the talk, and emphasize the things I wanted. So we're using as a model of performance a value stream or pipeline. Imagine water flowing through a pipe. And what we've got in this setting is it's a fairly lumpy pipe in which some bits are wider than others. And, you know, we've got this metaphor of the bottleneck. So B is a bit of a bottleneck between A and C. And D is also a bottleneck, but because D is the tightest, it constrains the whole flow. You can make B wider, any of A, B, C, and E wider, but it's not going to increase the overall flow through this system. And, you know, the metaphor where it came from in manufacturing was a staged process where you've got a certain amount of work being done with humans or machines at every step of the way. So, in a nutshell, the observation is that it's only improvement at D, at this global bottleneck, that makes a difference to the whole system, or to put it in more modern parlance, to the customer or the flow efficiency. If you've got people working everywhere, they can work as hard as they like, anywhere except D, but it won't make any difference, or as efficiently as they like, as long as D is that constriction. So the insight is that if you improve anywhere than other at the global bottleneck, you're not improving the overall efficiency of the system. And it could be worse. It could be that you're putting more pressure on the bottleneck. You may be distracting the people at the bottleneck. In a factory situation, you're building up inventory which might go to waste. So that's kind of profound. I'm going to take issue with aspects of it. So from this insight that if you can see where the global constriction is and that only improvement there will improve the overall system from a flow perspective or a customer perspective, which is kind of what counts, it gives you a way to focus your improvements. So step one is to identify where you think the bottleneck is, and then, you know, just do everything you can to exploit it or expand it. If there are people or machines working there and they've got other duties, take those away. Find any way that you can help at the bottleneck is helpful. And here's the interesting thing. There's also this implication that unless your system is totally efficient, there is feasibility to take capacity away from anywhere except the global bottleneck in order to improve things, to sort of shrink the pipe in other places in order to help expand it here. So in a production, in a team process where you've got people, I don't know, you could use the example of people standing up at a kitchen making schnitzels, vegetarian or meat. And you could have the first person is hammering the slice thin. You've got the hammering at A, and then coating with flour, and then coating with breadcrumbs, and then frying, and then serving. Well, if we think the bottleneck is the frying, then we can slow down these other bits and help out. Maybe we can get someone with a second fry pan. So if your hypothesis is that the bottleneck is at one spot, go help there. You'll know, because if you measure overall throughput, it will go up. If not, you better look again. And, you know, don't add capacity until you've done everything you can to help. Capacity should be that last resort. So buying an extra fry pan or employing more people. And then what's going to happen is that the bottleneck will eventually move. And then you go through the process again. So rather than trying to improve everywhere at once, this gives a very efficient way of freeing up capacity, and in order to improve in quite a targeted and compounding way. Does that make sense? So for those of us who came from Agile, where it was like, you know, inspect and adapt, reflect, this was, you know, at the team level, I found it originally really quite helpful, because what you do is, as a team, you'd say, well, what's slowing us down? And then how can we really target that problem and sort of swarm on the problem, even if we're doing different steps? So yeah, great stuff at the team level. But the point is that at the team level, you can at least see your system of work. Especially great if you're in a small company or a startup. We'll get to scale and what I mean by scale in a moment. So really great stuff in my view. So the takeaway is the theory of constraints, and of course there's more to it and elaborations, can help you optimize your improvement efforts. And now we come to my existential coaching crisis. So I started back in the 90s in software development, and in the early 2000s I got into this Agile stuff, and I thought this Agile stuff is great, but it's only for startups and small companies, because the culture of command and control in large companies aren't going to go for it. And that turned around with the global financial crisis, and for me in 2010, and I started getting interested in these large companies, and eventually doing work as a Scrum Master and Agile Coach, where I'd be called in. And typically, this is a picture of a visualization of the internet, I'd be called into some point where there was pain, and I would help the team or teams there get good. And then there would be something which was, this was before I heard of theory of constraints, there was something that was a little worrying to me, which was that I couldn't see the whole value stream. I couldn't see end to end. But I'd sort of try and increase my vision, collaborate around the boundaries, and bumble along. And then I heard about the theory of constraints. And of course, not only was it useful, it provoked for me, perhaps for others, a bit of a crisis. Because in a sufficiently large system where you can't see the whole value stream, the thing about the theory of constraints is it doesn't only say focus your improvement at that global bottleneck, but please don't make improvements elsewhere, because they may just be putting more pressure on the bottleneck. They may be counterproductive. In other language, you may be guilty of doing a sub-optimization in more formal terms. And so while I knew that there was pain where I was being called in, there was always this disquiet that maybe I'm making the larger system worse, because how do I know I'm at the global bottleneck? In a big enough value stream or system, statistically, I'm unlikely. And even if I am, by some coincidence, there are other people like me who've been called into other pain points, therefore, elsewhere on that same value stream, who are who will be doing the local optimization. I'm curious about those who've fulfilled similar roles to me, whether this has troubled you, or whether how you've thought about this issue.
I can go on that one.
Dan.
I think Bernd went first, and we can pass around. Yeah. All
right. So I can go on that one. So if I understand the question correctly, then you're basically asking, like, if you're coaching a team and you're improving their bottleneck, so to say, or you make any improvements on that team, but that team is not the global bottleneck, so to say, or is not working at the global bottleneck of the whole organization, that puts you in a dilemma as a coach. Is that what you're saying?
It was disquiet, yeah, and I'm smoothing over. There might be multiple value streams through the organization, but I just can't see all the way end to end. I might be typically in software delivery, and there's sort of upstream stuff about what work gets done and downstream stuff, operational and so forth. And it can get more complex than that, of course. Yes.
So for me, I found my piece by, so there's that other saying that basically says, if you try to create a local optimization, then that's usually only a problem if it's harmful to the global optimization. So, and that for me, that gave me a lot of peace, as in if I'm working with one team, and if the organization is really big, then by all means, yeah, like we're talking about very different subgroups, so to say, that, like barely even interact, so to say.
Yes. So
for me, that's, and I'm usually also hired by that subgroup, not by, not from the very top. So, so as long as I'm seeing that I'm working in a way that does not compromise the global optimum, then that for me is okay then. Does that make sense? So that's
how can you tell if you? Yes, it does, but I'd just like to tease a bit. How do you know how do you judge whether you might be compromising the global optimum or the global performance?
I mean, inherent in the work is the uncertainty, right? Like you don't have all the information, you don't have the full picture, and no one has, right? So for me, it's what I'm keeping my eyes out. I'm having my network within the organization. I'm trying to, be informed as much as possible. So if I'm seeing something or I'm hearing something that makes me believe that, that there might be something to my work being harmful to the global organization, to the global optimization. And not only my work, but indirectly my coaching influences the team, and the team then does something that, and so on. So if I'm seeing something like that, I'm trying to be as curious about that as possible. Which of course, like I'm working in the limitation of my skills and also in the limitation of the system, right? So, but yeah, that's basically it.
Cool. Murray, please.
Yeah, if I'm just working with one team, I'll start by helping them deal with their blockers within the team. But whenever you have a decent retrospective with a team, they're going to come up with blockers inside the team and blockers that are happening outside the team and the rest of the organization that are impacting them or impacting their ability to deliver a product into production that has some value. But I'll work with the team on their problems, and then I will be trying to work or raising issues anyway to management about things like not being able to deploy. That's a classic one. The team's going really well, but they can't deploy anything to production because there's this DevOps team that takes 3 months to deploy anything, and they're obviously not a real DevOps team, but pretty quickly we'll all be focusing on that because that is the real blocker.
Excellent. Was there one? Okay. Yes,
Yeah,
Dave. Steve, I think was tried a couple of times.
So I come from a different direction because I've been working with large organizations. Well, since Agile was starting to become popular, and I'm very familiar with the theory of constraints. So I have not witnessed, I have not experienced what you say, but I have witnessed it. I've seen many team leads, Scrum Masters, head even of engineering departments become really confused when you suggest to them that anything around the constraint should basically sit on their hands. So all those efforts of trying to improve all the time, which are even institutionalized in like the sprint retrospectives, coming with a message that really they are not contributing anything unless you're really focusing on where they are needed, creates a crisis. And often it could be to the extent of rejection. Or I have even had people that left, not grasping what it was about. They thought it was craziness. And yes, that's another aspect that you sometimes have to deal with, that these ideas might not be understood. So there you need to figure out how to make them come across. Often, like simulations or experiential learning are good ways where people start engaging like with their hands, and they feel the problem in some sort of exercise. But that dilemma is a huge psychological barrier for these ideas to, well, first to get understood, and even more to be practiced. And this relates a bit also to what you said before, because there is this culture that, hey, we pay your salary, so you better be productive and active. If you sit there and do nothing, you are a free rider. You're collecting rent. So there is even this sociological aspect that makes it not conventionally appropriate.
Dan, just sorry to interrupt. This is a really great conversation, but I'm aware we're about a third of the way through, and we're more than halfway through the time. Awesome. Just to, perhaps we should keep going, and then we can have a conversation at the end when the recording's finished.
Let's do it.
Cool.
Thank you. Sorry, Dave. I'm going to move it along. Thank you, Ian. So I'm just going to try and help with some of the intuition around this. It's compatible with theory of constraints, but here I'm going to make it a bit more human and a bit more around the cooperation and the vision aspect than the pipe analogy. So the smallest team I can think of is 2 people in a boat. And these people are specialists. One is at the front paddling on the left, and the other is in the canoe paddling on the right. Could be 3, could be 5, could be 10, but more than one is the point. So let's say that you're one of the people in the boat. Maybe I'm the other person and you're a faster paddler than me. And let's say, well, you're just better at paddling. And our objective is to paddle in a straight line. So, your KPIs say paddle fast. Should you paddle as fast as you can? No, we're going to go in circles if you do that. So what could you do instead? And I'm going to ask Ian for the audience participation just to facilitate the movement here. So what are some alternatives, Ian?
You could take a break. You could paddle on the other side occasionally. Not sure what else you could do. Start a motor up or something. Build a motor and get it going.
Yeah, you could give me tips.
Mm-hmm.
You could encourage me. Maybe I'm hungry. Maybe while you're having a break, you could feed me. Give me a coffee or something. Mm. But just working harder independently is not going to help with the objective. So let's apply the metaphor. But now I'm lifting from individuals. It does apply to individuals, but let's pretend it's teams. And I'm just giving 2 teams in the organization. Murray talked about a deployment or DevOps team beyond a development team. Let's say we've got sales and engineering, and the blindfolds metaphorically are to show that, unlike in the canoe where you can both see where you're going, they're a bit blinded by the silos and lack of information in this organization /canoe. So in the canoe, you can see where you're going. You can see what those objectives are. They're very clear. You can see what your partner is doing. Okay, you might have line of sight to what the organizational objectives are, but you might not see what the other team is up to. And you can see the collective dangers. So the reflection question, which I'll leave as a rhetorical one, is how well do the people, teams, and larger parts of your organization see and collaborate and communicate and align to objectives? And in these big complex organizations, perhaps not so well. And maybe they're just focusing quite narrowly on their KPIs or sub-objectives, which the hope is that they'll add up to alignment. So I've outlined the problem before, that if you can't see the whole value stream, the theory of constraints teaches us that our local improvement efforts will mostly make global performance worse if we just try to paddle as hard as we can and improve what we're doing without that coordination. A great option is to visualize the entire value stream. I think lean, think of a Toyota factory where it's quite a big system, but it's visible. At least that's the manufacturing. It doesn't take into account the design and sales. So it may well even apply there. Another answer is descaling until you can see the whole thing. But what if you can't? And my sense is that, like our Bant described, that I think basically what he and Murray intuitively understood, and that was how I was working before I started worrying about it, was, yeah, you do what you can locally and you put out your feelers more broadly. If you are damaging other teams, they will complain. And if you're damaging the whole system, hopefully that will give a response. But I just wasn't satisfied with that because of what the theory of constraints was telling me. Okay, so I think that's the intuitive way. You get as much visibility as you can, you work locally, but sort of sense outwards. And like Murray says, if you're escalating, that can be helpful. And starting to collaborate beyond your team is, I think, good advice. And Steve's coming from a different, from the top-down perspective, which also, if I understand correctly, has its challenges, as he outlined. So let's just look at theory of constraints versus this thing called scaled agile. When I started with agile, I thought it was just for teams, and then scaled agile came along. At the time, what I learned was that scale is hard, and it's really, by scale I mean complexity. And scaled agile, I think it certainly Murray will assure us that it's been successful as a sales thing. As will others. Has it been as successful as what might be possible? I'm going to cast some doubts on that, and maybe give some examples. So let's just talk for a moment about the pros and cons of both approaches. So we've looked at what the theory of constraints is, and we can imagine applying it at scale, not just at a team level, so the whole system. So it's great for rapid compounding improvement if you can reliably find that global bottleneck and overcome some of the cultural barriers that Steve talked about, and barriers of understanding. Then in principle, you can just focus where it's worse, open that up, find the next one, open that up, and give this rapid, consistent improvement, which is living the dream. But there are cons at scale, and I emphasize at scale. So you need that God's eye view to have any chance of finding the global bottleneck. So these big complex organizations make it really hard. And other teams and people get treated like cogs in the machine when they're told, no, sit on your hands, don't make improvements because you might be making things worse. So not only does morale suffer, but the muscles of improvement, like it could be years. If I mean, I don't know that anyone that many large complex organizations would attempt this, but if you did, then your improvement muscles would start to atrophy in the people and teams, because you've got to wait till it's your turn or until you're called to help across. That might be more theoretical. So there's issues with it. Great if you can see the whole value stream, but there's some questions here. Very very quick sketch of Agile at scale. I'm using Scrum at scale, could use SAFe as the popular one in Australia, Nexus less. Each of these pentagons represents a team, and we've got this idea of having a scrum of scrums where these teams collaborate. So there's some means of information flow up and down, and then you can use self-similarity and have scrum of scrums and so forth. If you're doing less, instead of having scrum teams or Kanban teams stacked up, you might have a portfolio Kanban over the top of a bunch of, or a tribe of teams, and then you might stack more Kanbans on top. So that's Agile at scale. And as Steve said, each team is instructed to make their own local improvements, and then teams share and learn from each other via some form of coordinating group or via other communication panels, pathways. So pros and cons. Pros, feels good. Everyone gets involved in improvement efforts locally in their team with their buddies, and they make a difference and they solve their local problems, maybe with the help of their Scrum Master or coach, or just getting onto it themselves. It's sort of scalable via these coordinating groups, these scrums of scrums, etc. Doesn't need the God's eye view, but the theory of constraints has already told us there are these deep problems with it. We're not really favouring the global bottleneck, and improvements in one place may well interfere elsewhere. I mean, hopefully we'll be sensitive enough to stop them, but we're sort of feeling our way. And trying to improve everywhere is tantamount to boiling the ocean. If we've got a budget for improvement, and even a notional budget for improvement, we've just smeared it fairly evenly, whereas we know from theory of constraints we should really focus where it's worse. Now, we may have other budget, we may be bringing in consultants or specialists, but when I first gave this talk in Canberra, one of I later learned one of the participants, who was an exec, said that they had these teams and Agile was going well. Some teams were upping their performance, but their global measures weren't improving until they started telling some of the teams who were doing well to help the other teams who were not doing so well. So they were starting to get that team collaboration happening. So my takeaway from this section is that the theory of constraints at scale and Agile at scale kind of have these opposite pros and cons. Okay, so the question, of course, is, can we get the best of both worlds? Can we have our cake and eat it too? And yeah, we can do it. I'll claim that we can. But I'm going to make a bit of a correction to theory of constraints at scale. So again, at scale is where you can't see the whole value stream. So here's my thought experiment. And this is my favorite beach on the Mornington Peninsula at Sorrento Back Beach, which I hope to be able to return to soon once the 25K limit lifts. So here's the situation. A team not working at the global bottleneck makes an improvement to their work process and finishes their usual 5 days worth of work, because these guys, or the guys and gals, are like a machine. For the sake of the experiment, there's very little variability. They deliver 5 days worth of work in 5 days, week in, week out, but they commit an active improvement. And so one of these retrospectives, they have an idea, they implement it, suddenly they're doing, next week, they've done their 5 days worth of work in 4 days. And on day 5, they go to the beach, lockdown permitting. So my question is, what effect does this have on the overall system? Dave, since you missed out on your anecdote, would you like to hazard a response?
So obviously this should have no impact on the global bottleneck, assuming that the same amount of value flows through their system in the same period, but now they've got an extra day to do whatever they want to do with that which sounds like the first question that you asked us at the start of the session.
Yeah.
Wow, you're sneaky.
Yeah. So I was that was creating a bit of anticipation and so back. So yeah, so they go to the beach. Now, they don't tell anyone, and that's easier at the moment with so many people working from home because it could damage morale externally, but internally, yay, they've gone to the beach for one day. And not only that, they've improved their system of work. So next week they'll finish in 4 days and they've got a day they could go to the beach again, or they could do something else with it. Okay.
They're more recharged.
They're recharged. Yeah, they're recharged by the first time. So global output is unchanged, morale increases. And what this thought experiment demonstrates, at least in some sense, is that everyone everywhere, not just at the global bottleneck, can improve all the time as long as we don't reflexively immediately do more work, because it's the doing more work that could improve things. Like if they're at the global bottleneck, it will, but otherwise it could create these negative knock-on effects. So local improvement we've achieved, globally no change yet, good or bad. So we're allowing everyone to improve. They're not de-optimizing the system, but they're not yet optimizing the system either. But we're close. We're doing better than what the theory of constraints told us was possible, because we've just attacked one element. Yeah.
On top of that, you've got some happier people as another benefit. Right, even if you haven't changed so their ability to sustain whatever pace over a longer period and become more valuable to the business. So there's another benefit which doesn't impact the global bottleneck.
And I find this super interesting because it sort of points to a kind of dual optimization, but that's a technical thing we can get to in discussion. But there's the local aspect and the global aspect. Spot on. Thank you. So what I'm saying is that responsible local improvement is possible, but so far it's insufficient to improve overall performance, but we've got happier people, less, which is a win. Yeah. So here's our mentor, our hero. This comes to my provocative law that after you make an improvement, the last thing you should do is more work, because you could de-optimize the system. And imagine my joy when I found a picture of Einstein at the beach, presumably the source material for the Philip Glass modern opera, which I recommend, but it's very long. And as Ian pointed out, and which I already realized, and irrelevant to this talk, is I'm not quite sure why Albert is wearing what appear to be lady sandals, but it's kind of interesting in a trivia sort of way. So that's more sort of an attention grabber. Let's break it down a bit. So really the subtext of this talk is about the economics of slack time. So if you want to make a virtuous cycle of improvement, and let's just think at the team level first, could be personal, and we'll go higher in a minute. You start with some useful slack. So if you're working all the time delivering, you can't even do this. You learn and experiment, which many of you did, and you attempt to make a local improvement. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it does, you get the same results in less time. You get a local efficiency improvement. And the first thing, I don't think there's any question you should do is celebrate, because you want that reinforcing behavior of people are making improvements. So let's reward that, at least with the one-off celebration, because remember, you've now freed up some time via a step jump. So yeah, reward that. And we've got this surplus slack, not only what we invested, but we've freed up a bit more extra time. And the theory of constraints sort of told us where we might find some of that. So I say the first thing you should do, now a lot of people will just do more work. I know this is an enlightened group. Whoa. But is reinvest in the team. So, prime that pump, give back a bit more time for further improvements. For one thing, they've proven at least once that they're capable of learning and improving. Who knows where that could lead? And then there's the question of what else you can do with it. So we've got some bad options, like reducing headcount. That's likely going to have a chilling effect on future innovation. What do you mean? The reward for going once around this virtuous cycle is that I get the sack, or my mate, my friend, my colleague gets fired? How's that going to drive further innovation? Permanently slack off, so go to the beach every week. I mean, there's, you've got a bit of reward by celebrating. It might be that the team's working excessive overtime, so there is a good version of this, which is where you bring down hours to a more sustainable level. But then we've got these two others: contribute at the next level, which Murray and Bant started to talk about, and do more of the same work. And the reason I've put the question there is to sort of how Bernd originally answered the what would I do is it depends. It depends on what the conditions are and the context, and we'll get to that in a moment. So it's sort of doing more of the same work. That should be the last thing that you should do, not reflexively the first thing. So yeah, celebrate, just to drive it home, reserve capacity for more learning and improvement, help others out, as many have suggested. You can share insights and learnings. If you've made an efficiency improvement locally, maybe it will work for other similar teams. Take some work away from the next level bottleneck. We'll come to what do we mean by that. Only do more of your usual work if you are slowing others down. I even believe there are more possibilities than this, but that's a pretty good start. I want to break that habit of, I've got a bit more time, I'm just going to work harder, because you might be doing damage. So, Prager's law: after you make an improvement, consider lots of possibly better options before you just do more of the same work. And now we come to paying it forward, the scaling aspect of this. So I'll try and talk you through this slide. It's a bit fractal, and we're looking for an alternative to the theory of constraints, God's eye view of how do we get the slack capacity to that global bottleneck over time without slowing things down inadvertently. So we'll see how we go. So we've got this idea, we've set up this virtual cycle of improvement in our local team. There could be many of them doing this in parallel. So Bant's doing one, Murray's doing another, Dave's doing one, etc., etc. And every so often they make a process improvement and they free up a bit of time. And they've celebrated and they've gone to the beach, but now they've got this decision. Should they do more work? Or should they help out in the larger organization and just learn something? They're already learning stuff by going around their loop. So we should ask ourselves, what's holding us back collectively? Now, we're switching here from the local section. Imagine this was like, maybe this team is in section A, so they're away from the bottleneck. Actually, let's make it easier. Let's say they're either at C or D. So if they're at C, they can probably look across to D and see, oh, that team is smashed. This was exactly Murray's situation where they're pumping out stuff and then it takes ages to deliver at the next stage. So there's a downstream one, could be upstream. So in that case, they should be doing whatever they can to help out. Alternatively, if they find that they're at the bottleneck, work's piling up behind them, people are screaming for them to deliver, then they should do more work and they should also ask for help. Other teams should be encouraged to direct effort to resources, help in whatever way. So we're playing the theory of constraints game again, but let's say it's at the team of teams level or at the local neighborhood. We may still not be able to see the whole value stream, but we can see a bit more of it. Okay, so rather than using that extra free slack just to widen C, we're directing it out. We're directing it towards D. Now, admittedly, if we were at A, B, and C, and we still couldn't see D. So at the neighborhood level, we're still away from the bottleneck. We'd just be smoothing out our section of the pipe. But what we're really doing is freeing up slack, and then the pattern continues, as we'll see. So what we've done here is we've improved the neighborhood. We may or may not have seen the global bottleneck yet. We may have, but we're doing our best not to immediately just pump up our area, but working collaboratively to do a bit better. So this means we need sense making at Scrum of Scrum levels, or from middle management, or from someone to be able to see a bit more of the bigger picture, if not the whole value stream. And guess what? We're now what we're doing is we're magnifying this virtuous cycle of improvement, generating more slack, but one level up. And the pattern can continue. That's the abstraction of it. Okay, is this making sense? Because this is the scaling part. And so for me, this was kind of, in Cynefin terms, you'd say moving from complex, bit of intuition, to, oh, I can see how it works. There's a protocol here. We can formalize it somewhat. So what it does amount to is very much trying to see as much of the system as you can. And as you're successful, moving wider and collaborating across scales, not so working in this kind of fractal way, but paying attention to how you optimize. And so the idea is that you don't necessarily have to have that God's eye view in order to identify there's the global bottleneck, but that there should be this kind of suction towards it up and down the scales. If only everyone was behaving in this way. But you can at least start with your team or in your patch. And if you're higher up the organization, you can perhaps influence and educate this kind of thinking a bit faster. So I've got this agile scaling meta framework. First, you've got to find some, yes, Dave.
Just on that last piece, it occurs to me you could do a simulation to see what would happen. You could create some pretty simple rules, have lots of teams in a big system, sort of simulate bottlenecks, and then sort of say, all right, that part has some slack, and see what happens over time. Does it actually, after so many cycles, does it actually, cause the whole system to have good flow, or does it create some unusual effects?
That will be a good way to sort of teach managers what the heck theory of constraints is as well, because they can see if you had one team going to help the global bottleneck, a physical visual, when we can get in the room, and that is anyway, of the whole system.
I've found that just drawing out the value stream map on a wall that shows your team in the middle of it and the teams before and afterwards helps quite a lot.
Yeah. I mean, at a recent gig, I basically had that situation where there was a bunch of teams delivering the automated build. And they said, "What do you mean? It took 4 days." And I went to one team who had one section of it. They said, "But it's done in an hour." No, it was a day once. It was continually breaking and referring to other teams for fixing. And there were about 4 of these things. And so what we did was we basically drew that value stream, started measuring it, showed that there were, a day or, 4 to 14 hours for each, and just had this mantra of, got that group together so they could see more of the system and talk about their pain points, and said, we're data driven and our mantra is this is no blame. Let's just look at this section of the value stream. Where should we start? What can we do to start doing it? So yeah, even without the full value stream, any way that you can start to see the system helps, and then showing people, and they go, oh, I thought it was just an hour, because they were just staring at that one little bit. Okay. So yeah, the meta framework is sort of step one, going all the way back to the beginning, is encourage people to find a bit of slack and you know, work on whatever their biggest local bottleneck is that should be visible within a team if you've got reasonable visibility. And then there's this work about getting visibility at teams of teams levels and beyond. Yeah, choose your favorite way to improve and start working on it, but don't reflexively do more work. Okay, instead, it's to help others contribute, reinvest in learning and improvement. I think there's big stuff here also about sense making and simplification. Yeah, this is me going, when we brought in Agile, we mainly, you know, applied it to the lower level teams, whereas we need much more done at higher levels. So I'm just using this metaphor here of game design. If work and frontline staff are playing a cooperative game, then the structure of the system and how we interact is an activity of game design, and that can be a very rich role for people who are higher up the system and have a bit more visibility to start doing. The metaphor for systems thinking really, along with mentoring, facilitating, role modeling, because of, you know, there's huge cultural changes implicit in this, learning and experimenting, and, you know, and critically less competitive individualism and becoming the bottleneck of decision making by saying, oh, decisions have to go up and down all the time. If you read General McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, that works to a similar intuition about how the US military had to change when faced with Al Qaeda, where they were getting smashed until they started really seriously decentralizing and changing power balances within the organization. So yeah, scaling improvement in this decentralized way depends on this collaborative use of Slack, freeing it up and then using it in these constructive ways to help each other sense make and cooperate across the whole organization, and, you know, ideally simplify and descale. So almost there. Conclusion. So some people claim you can only work from the top. My claim is you can start where you are without damaging the local system. So I no longer have that stress. And I'm happy to be able to confirm that people like wonderful coaches like Bent and co, and all of you present, I'm sure, had the right intuition. But now you know. Dave's point is just so amazing, that we're optimizing for not only for global performance, but also happiness. You know, if you think you'll get more by taking every local performance and just going work harder, it's counterproductive. So my joke is that even if you were a psychopath, you should be trying to make people happier via this approach, because that's going to deliver you your global performance. Even if you don't care about them, you actually need to give them this autonomy and space, or I shouldn't say give them, permit them what they deserve as human beings. But a lot of this is counterintuitive. Dave?
Yeah, and not only that, that happiness contributes significantly to quality. So when you think about, you know, it's not just the performance of the work there and then, but because humans are involved and humans dictate so much of the quality, there's only so much we can automate and systematize and all that sort of stuff. There's always a contribution from the humans. So happier humans tend to have better quality.
Indeed. So stop focusing on lifting local output, start freeing up time, setting up these virtuous cycles and contributing at the next level. Or if you're higher up, then working up and down the scales. So my final thoughts, there's always a larger system. You know, the further up I go in organizations, people are always looking up. I'm guessing that the CEOs are going, oh, well, we're in this economy, and, you know, unless you're God, there's, you know, you can only start where you are. Yeah, so you don't have to wait for change. But we've got to see more of the system. We can't just you know, try and work to our KPIs, and where they say work harder, go further, there's got to be this responsiveness and cooperation and collaboration. And there's huge, you know, there's huge potential, I think, you know, where I said before how Agile at Scale wasn't necessarily delivering that much, because I believe because of these misalignments, which Steve was referring to, that can be cleaned up. Yeah, I'll change this talk from a couple of years ago. There are huge problems in the world, so I hope that you will try and change the world. I think we need to. We've got a lot of things which need to be sorted out, but we need to learn how to, you know, how to solve problems, and I suspect get better at collaborating. So my final takeaway is there's always that bigger system, and you can start where you are.
Well done, Dan.
Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really, really good. I think you've done some really deep thinking on this and distilled out some really clear thinking and put it in a form where we can understand it. So really good job. I saw this a couple of months ago with and you've done another really good iteration on this. So well done.
Thank you.
I think might stop recording because the YouTube video is going to be quite long already. But why don't we all go off mute and just thank Dan, and then I'll stop recording and we can carry on the conversation afterwards. So well done, Dan. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
And I'll
Okay.
stop.
I can bring up slides again if needs be.